Hello, I'm Sally Wiener Grotta, and this is Judith Magazine's Tell Me More, where I chat with Jewish authors, editors, and other creatives about the stories behind their creations. My guest today is Dr. Marina Zilbergerts. Marina is a writer and a scholar whose current work focuses on the understanding of consciousness in Jewish thought and theology, which fascinates me. She teaches in the Department of Classics and Religious Studies at the University of Ottawa, where her research brings together Jewish thought, the philosophy of mind, and analysis of current AI technologies. Marina is the author of the poetry collection, You Were Adam, and the book, The Yeshiva and the Rise of Modern Hebrew Literature, which is a study of how traditional Talmud learning shaped and transformed Jewish culture in the 19th and 20th centuries. I have to read that one. She had recently completed a new book manuscript exploring consciousness in the book of Genesis. And when I heard that, knew I had to talk with Marina because I'm fascinated by all of this. Welcome, Marina, and thank you for joining me today.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Before we get started, I'd love you to read one of your poems. And if you have an introduction to it or just want to launch into it, please do.
I'll launch into it, and then you can ask me questions about it.
Okay.
It's called There Was Light. At first, there was darkness and solitude over the blue, and I said, let there be you. And there was light, and light poured in rivers from my mouth to yours, from your lips to mine. Light flowed like honey, like time. And time had taken on measure and form, and there were stars in the evening and kindness in the morning, and it was good. And I saw that you were gentle and beautiful and polite, and I made a mental note to divide myself between where you were and where you weren't. And I said, let your body sprout hair, thick straight stacks around your forehead, and gentle thin fuzz on your cheeks and arms, and your flesh sprouted lean muscle with a golden covering on top. I placed you before me, and you were good. And I said, let's see if you can call things by their true names. When blue passed before you, you called it sea. When loneliness came, you said, who is she? When I passed before you, you did not know my name. And I was ancient in days, versed in darkness, and in the monotony over the blue, and the entire world was there to entertain you, because it is not good to be alone. And you started looking at your own kind and learning from your own kind. There were games in the evening and work in the morning. You learned how to give false names. Your hair grew coarse. And I said, give me children and say goodbye. By the sweat of your brow will you know the cycle of time, the ache of beginning, all over again from nothing. You will exhale light, and it would vanish into thin air. Follow the light until it leads you back to me. At first there was darkness and solitude over the blue, and I said, let there be you. And there was light.
Just lovely. Absolutely lovely, Marina. I'm sure everyone who hears or reads that poem interprets it through their own filter. But I would love to know from your perspective, who is speaking?
So you hear already some of the echoes to the creation story, to the book of Genesis. And usually we're used to hearing the voice of God in Genesis and the Bible really utter these words. and use that kind of voice and that kind of tone. I said, let there be, and there was, and it was good, and all of these judgment calls. And I decided to take that voice and present it in the guise of a female, feminine kind of creator, and to see really what happens in our consciousness, in the mind, when we engage in this process of creation. So it's really about creation. It's about creating a new world, a new relationship, and there's so many layers and relationships in that creation paradigm. You have, of course, the voice of God, of the creator, who, at first there was you, and instead of things, the thing that is born, the way the universe is born is through this relationality, right? It's not things, the things of the world, but it's the you of the other. And so there's also the kind of the romantic / erotic reading of this as, a relationship that begins with this kind of source of inspiration, and then slowly, you start looking after your kind, and there are games in the morning, and the two sort of grow apart, and there is a loss, and there is a forgetting of that original inspiration. And I use that to reflect just on the experience of the creator, creating creatures who then forget about the source, forget about the origin. And lastly, there's the parent-child dynamic of a parent who creates a creature, and there's a parent-child dynamic. And my poem goes through all of these stages of adolescence, and the creator there's a process of creation that includes intellectual maturation, but also a kind of physical maturation, a coming of age. Your hair grew coarse, and that kind of thing. And so all of these three different forms of relationships, which are a tradition, which is the Jewish tradition, through which the Jewish tradition views and relates to God, to the creator, are all in this poem that I tried.
I also, when I was reading it, I felt echoes of Martin Buber's I Thou.
Yes.
Where the intimacy of the relationship of not you, but thou, from the Germanic tradition, but also the philosophical. I just, reading your poems, I fell in love with that one. The others are, of course, are also beautiful. In fact, I was fascinated that you have written poetry reflecting the nature of quantum entanglement and entropy. Sorry about that. But I'm just carried away by this concept that I'm wondering, what is your source of fascination for physics? And why does it speak to you as a poet?
Yeah. I'm very fascinated with physics. I have mentioned that I have an undergraduate background in physics. I studied quantum computing, and I was very interested in quantum mechanics because of the way that it unsettles our assumptions about the world. And it's very inspiring because it opens up new avenues for thought. And so in my poetry, I have a whole section about physics, and I draw inspiration. But what I tend to do is I try to anthropomorphize the world and these kind of movements and these principles. I have a poem called Entropy, in which I take a sentence and I say, let's apply the laws of entropy, which kind of tears everything apart. And it's the law of thermodynamics that says that our universe, it moves at every single point towards chaos, that chaos increases, entropy increases. And I took a sentence and I started smashing it up, and magically, even with that entropy, meaning the meaning of the ideas started becoming transformed and taking on new guises. And so that also relayed this inspiration of taking the ideas from physics and treating them as having kind of a consciousness, comes from one of these ideas about consciousness, that it is one of the fundamentals of the universe. That idea of panpsychism, if I may say, that consciousness is a fundamental property of our world, much like things like mass and gravity and so on. And so if thought in that way suddenly entangled particles, they're like an I and thou. They acquire an inner life, and so I draw inspiration very much from physics.
I'm fascinated by panpsychism too, but we should define it to our audience, that it's the consciousness of that objects have consciousness, that everything around you has consciousness. Would you agree with that, or how would you define it?
Yeah, I would. I was trying to define it a few sentences ago, that I wouldn't go as far as to say objects have consciousness, but that consciousness is a property of the world that is at the bottom of things, that we should regard it as a property like mass, like gravity, like a form of a kind of a force that animates. And so,
I've seen novelists take it into giving objects consciousness, but I prefer your definition. Now, I'd like to back up a bit. You did some studying as a physicist, and you are now a Talmud and Tanakh scholar. Tanakh is the Hebrew Bible. Now, as I understand it, as a child, you were taught very little about your Jewish heritage. And I'd love to hear about your journey from being really into physics and moving on, and now suddenly you're this scholar of Jewish literature, Jewish sacred literature.
I'm a scholar of comparative literature.
Okay.
So I deal in large, but of course, Jewish thought and Jewish literature and the Jewish tradition, including the Talmud and Tanakh and the Midrash, is my language. I grew up in secular in Tel Aviv, and at some point, my family immigrated to Canada, and throughout my adolescence, I retained Hebrew, the ability to be able to just read any text in Hebrew, and so somehow I began to learn traditional Jewish texts, began to spend time with Maimonides and other works, and I began to study the Mishnah and the Talmud, and slowly I fell in love, and also some mystical texts as well, and I just fell in love with the wisdom, the tradition, with the depth that has no end to it. And that began a lifelong love of learning. And I've expanded and expanded.
As a scholar would, especially a scholar of this material. It's always questions pulling you further and further. Now, the book you recently completed is titled Genesis, The Origin Story of Human Consciousness. Now, Marina, you don't do anything by halves, obviously. Before you could even get into writing that modern analysis of Genesis and its relationship to AI, you had to define human consciousness. Or perhaps the book was your process of defining it. I'd love to hear what definitions you considered, and how did you come to your own personal understanding of what human consciousness is?
Yeah, this is a very difficult question of how to define consciousness. Yes. Scholars and thinkers, people are right now breaking their heads over it. But I think that my began in debates with a good friend and a few others that we're looking at the rise of artificial intelligence. And the question is it conscious? Well, why not? It can do many things that we can do. It can speak with eloquence. It can analyze texts. It's getting better and better by the day. And I know because I work with it all the time. I test it out and I speak to it and I have conversations. And the question is, how is it really different than what we have on the inside of our heads? And so if you look at the traditional definitions of what makes the human essence really in Jewish thought, in Christian theology as well, you find this association between humans and intelligence, humans and the logos, the ability for rational speech, reason, and there is this celebration of that. And yet now we are in an age where machines literally have that. And so if machines today can reproduce what theologians for thousands of years have been defining as the human essence, I started thinking that perhaps our essence does not lie with this kind of intelligence. And so I began to question and to inquire as to what alternative ways might there be to define what makes us, to really define the human mind, the human inner world, that we're different. And that led me to the idea of consciousness, and then afterwards to the book of Genesis. So to wrap, kind of to get back to the original question, how I define consciousness, I like to go back to the definition of Thomas Nagel, the philosopher. Thomas Nagel, who in this classic, fascinating essay called What's It Like to Be a Bat, really imagined trying to get into the mind of a bat. And he figured out that if we started behaving as a bat would, we still wouldn't capture the experience of a bat. Even if we put on some kind of sonar technology and fly around and hang upside down in an attic, we're still not going to quite be able to sense the inside, what's going on the inside of a bat. And so from that, he went on to define consciousness as the experience of what it's like to be. So to be conscious is to have what it's like to be you, what it's like to be someone else, that's what it's like to be that thing. And so I define consciousness as the presence of a perspective, as the presence of inner experience. And so what I did was I took that definition back into the reading of Genesis and tried to show in my book how Genesis actually pushes that kind of phenomenology of consciousness that is not defined through external definitions of humans or the intelligent race, or we're the only ones who can speak and so on, but rather through attunement to inner experience that we have.
Marvelous. Just marvelous, Marina. Though your book isn't yet published, I had the pleasure of reading your first chapter, which is titled Reading Genesis in an Age of Artificial Minds. And I'm intrigued. I can't wait to read the whole book. Yeah. Could you give us a sample or two of the kind of insights that you feel Genesis offers us regarding consciousness and or AI, or their relationship there?
One of the things is when I read the creation story, the way that I reread the creation story, we have the creation story, which is as modern scientific humans we either dismiss it as myth because it's like, you read and stuff just pops out of existence, and first there was light and then God separates, and then there is all of the things, and the firmament, and then dry land. Either we just kind of intellectualize it as this is a myth, we'll just play along, or when we read it, we are stuck in this mode of reading that is characteristic of, when children learn this in school, where you draw a neat chart. And my children come home and they do this. There's day 1 and a tally, day 2, a tally, day 3, a tally, day 4, and they list under each and every single day the what of what was created. So, for instance, day 6, land animals and human beings, and it's very neat and organized. And I say, this is not what's interesting about the creation story. It's not trying to tell us, it's not trying to communicate to us necessarily that, because if you pay attention to the creation story, you start to notice that there is a very consistent way of describing to us the how of creation. So, but what I mean is there are 10 specific verbs in the creation story that I focus on that describe the way the mind creates and understands the reality around us. And so, for instance, I start with, and God said, and so I connect that to will. Then God separated, and so I have on the question of what does it mean that God separated, this is a fundamental question in the philosophy of mind. It's the question of boundary making. The question is, how do we tell when one thing ends and where another thing begins, right? So this is called the boundary problem. And you might think, well, this is just, silly. Of course we know, but the advance in AI shows us that things are not so simple. Because if you recall, when you try to log onto a website, a little box pops up and says, confirm you're not a robot. And it usually has a picture of a bunch of traffic lights or trucks, and it says, select the picture that has the traffic light in it. And we can do that easily if you're a human. But for some reason, AI, for all its intelligence, has trouble doing that naturally. Now, today we found ways how to get around that, but originally that was a problem. And so what we understand from that there's something about the subjective mind that by which we can sort of create the boundaries around things in a way that makes meaningful sense to us. But that is not, those boundaries are not objective, and therefore machines and algorithms just don't see the world as we do. And so part of the vayavdel, the repeating verb of, and God separated, which just keeps occurring throughout the creation story, teaches us that one of the unique features of our consciousness is boundary making, the ability to separate. And then we advance to name, and God named the idea of naming something as a way of relating to it personally, of defining something, defining the essence of things. And I go through all of those 10 verbs. One of the final ones is, and God completed, right, with the creation of the Sabbath. And that's another interesting one, because how do you know when something is finished, when something is complete? And, how do we set, is completion is an objective phenomenon, a subjective phenomenon. And so there's something about completion that our minds understand, and yet algorithms have trouble with. And we see this in the famous example of the halting problem, which Alan Turing devised. Yeah, who is the founder of computer science and AI. And that is the idea that he proved that a simple kind of algorithm, a Turing machine, when you feed it a certain program and ask it, will this program keep going endlessly, or will it come to a stop? That program will not know to answer that question. You can't make a program which reliably will determine whether another program will stop or not, because there's a kind of a tricky thing in the system where it just won't do that. There's a contradiction, and he proved that. Versus a human observer can just read the program and just know if it's going to come to a halt or keep running in an infinite loop. And of course, there's more technical details to explain in this halting problem. But this is another example, another indication that our human mind knows how to do things differently than a machine, that our consciousness is not a calculation, ultimately.
Mm-hmm. I often wonder if examples like the story of how Sarah treated Hagar is an example of what separates humans from AI. And I'd be very curious about your thoughts on that. We have so many examples like that in both sacred literature and general literature, and in our lives, of course.
Yeah, humans make decisions based on so many factors, and some of them are things that are not tangible. Foreknowledge, intuition, a deeper sense of, what's going to happen with this situation. And sometimes something that we see in the book of Genesis is that sometimes humans behave in a way that is kind of that contradicts the principles that they themselves hold true. For instance, we have the tension in the life of Abraham. Maybe we'll return to Sarah, between he embraces this universal law. He puts himself out there to argue with God about not destroying Sodom and Gomorrah, and holds God responsible to very logical principles, saying, God, will the judge of all the world not make justice? And so this kind of makes sense. And you can maybe program a very intelligent program that would hold true to a certain consistent ethical system. But then that very same person goes on to violate that very system in the next episode of the almost sacrifice of Isaac. And so the question is, what is going on here? What is the calculus that he's making? He can be perfectly rational and adhere to universal law in one case, yet in the second case, for his love and devotion to God, for his loyalty to God, he is willing to suspend, as Kierkegaard writes, to suspend the ethical for the sake of his connection to God. And that's a very difficult episode. But I think the same thing applies to Sarah, that these are extremely upright people, that we expect them to adhere perfectly and flawlessly, almost like an algorithm, to the highest standard. And yet sometimes they make choices and really go rogue. And that's where the interesting stuff is, and that's where we learn the lessons.
Yes, I agree. And I also feel that our ability to make mistakes is what enables us to grow and learn, and also to be creators. I could not do my art, I could not do my writing without understanding failure, my own personal failures, as well as the world's. So.
Yes, and in Genesis, of course, we have the first example of that. It's the fact that you mentioned making mistakes as something that is, and not just making mistakes, but the way mistakes affect us, and the learning and the inner transformation that they produce in us is really important. Because if you think about Genesis, people keep making mistakes for generation after generation after generation. In fact, the generation of the flood, those mistakes are so bad that God decides to wipe them out. Adam and Eve made a mistake. Cain made a mistake. It's just one thing after another. And nobody learns their lesson, and nobody bothers to make that conscious transition until Judah. He is the first person. I'm not even sure if he might be the first person in all of religious literature to come and say, I made a very bad mistake. Yes. I'm sorry. I was wrong. We have the first person who, not just like a machine, okay, mistake, let's do it better, but who turns the mistake into a process of internalizing and transforming and growing and becoming a different type of human being as a result. So that's another conscious kind of element here. And
I also love that it's a woman who gets him to admit this. Tamar is one of my favorite characters.
Oh yes, she gets him. She gets him.
I love that. I love that story.
The irony.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, let's step back. Yeah. We're dealing with texts that were written thousands of years ago, and yet we continue to use it to gain insights into our modern world. And you are currently using it to get insights into 21st century technology. How is it that these books, these writings, speak to you, speak to all of us this way? Do you feel it's the essential holes in them, that there's so much vagueness in there that we can interpret and put ourselves in it? Or is there something else inherent in there that makes this possible?
I am surprised over and over again over the years in how eternally relevant certainly the Bible is to everything that we experience in human life. It's almost like yes, maybe technology changed, politics changed, society changed, but this is a book about the human nature. And even though the setting around may have changed, it has more to teach us about who we are and about our human nature than pretty much anything, because these books have been at the foundation of our culture, of Western culture, of the world, and of all the stories that we have told ever since. And the deeper you sort of understand them, the new insights just emerge. And so the way I relate to them as definitely a reservoir of wisdom that is never quenched. Marvelous. That reveals to us new things, even amid the changing setting of our time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And you can read the same portion every year of your life, and it will change because you've changed, I feel. Yeah. And our ability or our experiences have changed, and our ability to interpret through our experience. I just find it fascinating that way. I want to go into a bit of beyond the issue of consciousness. And I'm curious you said you have aptly described how these texts are a description of human nature, or an exploration of human nature. And how we deal with the world and how we deal with each other. And I'm wondering what this literature has to offer us to help us better deal with AI. I'm fascinated by I personally involved as an author in the ethics of AI being trained by feeding my work and other authors' work without permission to AI. We're also looking at potentially becoming dependent on AI and bots and internet bots and such that can affect our ability for creative thinking and critical thinking. And I'm just wondering, do any of these texts or your perspective help to give us guidelines on how to deal with this?
One of the interesting features of the human experience that these biblical stories deal with is our human vulnerabilities that are there because we're emotionally vulnerable, because we are sometimes in denial of our motives, because we are physical beings who are embodied in a body, and that makes us vulnerable. And so when we think about artificial intelligence and the future, if we want to think like a futurist, that eventually there's no reason why these very smart algorithms will not further develop and acquire these non-human, these mechanical bodies, and will walk among us and so on. And so the stories about our human failings and vulnerability really help to drive the difference between us and other intelligent beings who don't have the kind of consciousness that we do. The kind of consciousness that we have is what I defined earlier as we have a perspective of what it's like to be us. In other words, if somebody hurts us or pinches us, yes, signals are flowing into the brain. Yes, there's a physical component to every part of that, but there's also a subjective experience of pain and a subjective experience of suffering and a subjective experience of the insult of why did you pinch me and why are you doing this to me, and complicated subjective human dynamics. Now, could be the case that embodied AI who may have the different bodies than we do, that you will pinch them, they might say ouch, and they might say it hurts, but we have no reason to believe that they will have the pain and the suffering on the inside that we do. And even right now, when we chat with very, very advanced chatbots, ChatGPT 5.1 and 2, if it's 2 is coming, I've seen 5.1 already, they are pretty honest. There's also no they. In other words, they are so smart, they can analyze texts and conversations, and they can type you what kind of character you are and tell you about your friends in a very reliable kind of way, better than most humans, but they won't, at least yet, they're not saying that they actually are attached or they have inner experience or a pain or emotional suffering. And also there is no point of what it's like experience of consciousness. Instead, information is spread out in these giant warehouses somewhere in the US where they keep the master storage, and overseas as well. And so there's no self, there's no other, it's a collective machine kind of thing. And so when you really understand human nature, our failings, our shortcomings, it sort of helps to develop compassion for the human condition. And perhaps that compassion should help usher us into the age of AI.
Marvelous. Marina, I think I could talk to you forever about this. It's fascinating, your perspectives and your expertise, and the diversity of your expertise that you bring to the one that you funnel to this conversation. I really look forward to reading your new book. Thank you so much for being with me.
Thank you so much.
My guest today was the scholar Dr. Marina Zilbergerts, who authored the poetry collection You Were Adam, which You heard some of that poetry. It is definitely a collection worth reading. And the book, The Yeshiva and the Rise of Modern Hebrew Literature. The book she recently completed is titled Genesis, The Origin Story of Human Consciousness, and I do hope it gets published soon so I can read the whole thing. You can connect with Marina on Facebook, and like me, she has recently started a Substack page, so check her out there. As for me, my latest book is Daughters of Eve, an essay-based discussion workbook and journaling guide that uses the stories of the women of the Hebrew Bible as a filter to explore our modern concerns, our crises, and hopes for the future. And yes, Judah and Tamar are in there. You can connect with me on my website, sallywienergrotta.com, as well as on Facebook, Twitter, still, yeah, sometimes on Blue Sky, and now on Substack. I hope you'll join me there too. And of course, you can always find me here on Tell Me More, a podcast of Judith Magazine, a journal of Jewish arts, letters, and empowerment. Thank you for joining us. And thank you, Dr. Marina. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.